Hi, and welcome to the second Lean Impact bonus tutorial. In the first video, we walked through the process of identifying a solution and building a plan to validate it. Now, it's time to do that validation. This video corresponds to the second worksheet in the bonus materials, the sprint worksheet. In this video, I'll walk you through one way that you might consider organizing your validation process. Of course, you should feel free to adapt this for your own unique circumstances. So what is a sprint? Think of a sprint as one iteration of your validation process. In order to test your solution, you can generally expect to run multiple sprints. This will grow in complexity and scope over time. And even after your core solution is validated, you want to continue to run sprints as you add new features, deploy to new customer segments, and experiment with ways to increase your overall value, impact, and growth. Today, let's start with our first sprint. At the end of the first video, we prioritized our assumptions along two dimensions, the degree of risk and how difficult it will be to test. And for the assumptions that will take innately longer to validate, we identified precursors that we could test more quickly first. So for our first sprint, let's start by taking the highest risk assumption that has the greatest chance to make or break your solution, something I call a killer assumption. In the case of a tie, pick the one that will be easiest to test and start with that. Now, let's turn to our worksheet. We'll start out by filling in the first part of the worksheet with the context from your solution validation plan, so we have it for easy reference. Then we'll add in your assumption. This is the riskiest assumption that you decided to test first with this sprint. Now it's your turn. Go ahead and make a fresh copy of the sprint worksheet and fill it out. Then come back and we'll walk through the process of running a validation sprint. As you know, Lean Startup is based on the scientific method. So a sprint is basically a scientific experiment. And of course, that starts by framing a hypothesis. Think of a hypothesis as putting an aspect of your assumption into concrete and measurable form. A single experiment and the hypothesis that goes with it might only test one dimension of a particular assumption, or it could even shed light on multiple different assumptions. In either case, it should help you learn and make an informed decision on your next steps. Don't forget to start small. Think of the quickest and cheapest way that you can learn something to gain more or less confidence in your assumption. Let me give you an example. So if I want to test my assumption that unemployed youth would be interested in my training, I might frame a hypothesis this way. If I offered a free job skills training to these youth, then 75% of them in this township would sign up for the waiting list and provide their mobile phone number, indicating their interest in attending the training. Now it's your turn. Try framing your hypothesis this way. First, what is the simplest offer you could give people to gauge how they might respond? Before investing in a full-fledged product or service, it's helpful to understand if people will even be interested. Second, then consider how many people will need to accept your offer in order for you to reach your success criteria and your ultimate goal. It's best to use a percentage or a unit level metric if possible, so you can project the likely uptake as you scale. With a fixed number, you can be tempted to go out to thousands of people just to find the few that will engage. But of course then you'll soon run out of potential customers. Third, be clear what customer segment you want to focus on. For early experiments, it's good to start with early adopters who feel the problem most acutely. If even they're not interested, it's unlikely others will be. And they'll be eager to give you lots of great feedback. Fourth, what kind of response are you looking for? Try to go beyond, yeah, I like that, which somebody might just say to avoid offending you. Instead, add a little friction and see if they're seriously interested. Now, it's your turn. Hit pause and think about how you would frame your hypothesis for testing your assumption, and then we'll come back and look at how we'll run an experiment to test that hypothesis. Now that you have a hypothesis in hand, the next step is to design an experiment to test it. This is where an MVP comes in, or a minimum viable product. The M in MVP is key. Is there something you could learn in an hour, in a day, or in a week? Push yourself to find the simplest experiment you can run where you can learn something. That way, you can avoid wasting precious time and money heading down the wrong path. Of course, there's some situations which innately need to take a bit longer, such as building a jet engine, as Eric describes in The Startup Way, or growing crops. So what's appropriate will be situational, but in most cases you can find ways to do something less perfect or less comprehensive that will give you useful data before you go on to building a full solution. In chapters 7, 8, and 9 of Lean Impact, I include numerous examples of MVPs for each of the 3 types of hypotheses that may give you some ideas of what might work in your situation. So let's go back to my example. If I want to test my hypothesis that these unemployed youth would be interested in attending my training, an MVP I might design could look like this. I might create 2 different types of flyers. One focused on the message of the job opportunities and the potential to make money, and another flyer that focuses more on messages of empowerment and the opportunity for independence. Now I might take these flyers to a township and pitch each of them to 50 different youth and see how many of them are interested in signing up to attend the training. Now it's your turn. Design an experiment that can validate or invalidate your hypothesis. Be sure to answer these following questions. Who? Who is the specific customer demographic that you will focus on? What? What will you present to them? A prototype, a mock-up, a flyer, a video, or something else? Where? Where will you do this? Make sure it fits with who you are trying to reach. When? When are you going to run the experiment, and for how long? And how? Come up with an action plan for who will do what. Most importantly, set a date, time, and place to review the results. Too often, people run experiments, then get caught up in their day-to-day work and don't take the time to fully consider the results and the right next steps. Now it's your turn. Hit pause and think about how you will design your MVP to test your hypothesis. Now, no excuses. It's time to go and run your MVP. Don't wait for the perfect time and place. Just do it. If you're not sure you're doing it right, you'll learn a lot just by getting out of the building and interacting with customers. So pause this video and don't come back until you're done running your first experiment. So, how did the experiment go? Did you learn something? Whether you had a profound insight or things didn't quite go according to plan, it's time to have a review meeting, discuss what you learned, and decide what's next. Document what happened, both with the experiment itself and with what you learned about your hypothesis and your assumptions. What could inform your next experiment or the design of your solution? And don't forget to determine, was your hypothesis validated? Be honest with yourself, as we all have a tendency towards confirmation bias. We'll end up on the best path if we're willing to keep our eyes open and find the pitfalls early on. If you find that almost all your experiments succeed, ask yourself, are you truly understanding the risks? And if you are, could your solution be more ambitious? So let's go back to my example and take a look at what might have happened. I went out to a township and pitched these 2 different versions of my training to youth. It turned out the first version, promising them higher incomes, caused 82% of them to sign up to my training. The second version, not so much. Only 32% accepted. But overall, I'd call the experiment a success because I had a target of 75% of youth signing up, and I found a version of the training that was interesting enough to these youth that 82% of them would sign up. Now, what are some of the things I learned? I learned that the youth were most motivated by the tangible promise of income, more so than abstract notions of empowerment and independence. I also learned that the pitch was best received by youth when it was made by a staff member who came from that community and understood the local culture. Some of the other things I noticed was that youth were asking about computer skills training. Some of them couldn't actually read the flyer. And others raised concerns about where the training would take place and how they would be able to pay for transport to be able to get there. All of these learnings can inform what I do next. So now that you've completed your first experiment, what's next? If we turn back to the lean impact workflow, as you'll see, we've made it all the way through to running tests and MVPs. Now, based on the results, if you're successful, you can keep going and test your next riskiest assumption, or double down and increase your investment. But if your hypothesis was invalidated, we'll need to take a look at other options. Does this just require some refinement, or have we revealed a more fundamental flaw and need to consider a major pivot? If you can see a way to make things work, by all means, try a smaller refinement first. But if you tried a few variations and still aren't making any headway, it's time to consider a bigger change. Let's go back to my example. In my case, I declared this experiment a success. After all, I was able to verify that at least 75% of youth were interested in this training I had to offer. So when I think about what's next, I want to consider the two other killer assumptions that I had identified. One around validating that there are enough jobs available if I were to train all these youth. And the second is to start looking at the employers. Will the employers be interested and willing to hire these youth after they're trained? So, to wrap up on this sprint, in your review meeting, agree on whether your hypothesis was validated or invalidated. Now, be honest. If it was validated, is there another killer assumption you identified? If so, you might consider testing it next. If not, you may be ready for the next level of investment with a higher fidelity prototype, or reaching out to a larger audience, or trying to target broader demographics. On the other hand, if your hypothesis was invalidated, consider smaller tweaks, then more significant pivots. Do you think that your experiment might work by tweaking your messaging or your targeting? If so, that's worth trying. In my MVP, if I had only made flyers that focused on the message of empowerment, or if all the people who were making the offer were foreign to the neighborhood, my first experience may well have failed. But by modifying the message or the messenger, I could still have found the right formula that would enable my solution to succeed. When you run into diminishing returns, though, then you may want to consider a different mix of success criteria that would still lead to your goal. For example, if my hypothesis continues to be invalidated and I'm simply unable to find a way to interest a significant enough number of youth, I might take a new approach. Perhaps I might run a training for the few who are interested, see if they get jobs, and if so, maybe their friends will suddenly become interested too. That might be a different set of success criteria worth testing. But if we run out of options for a solution to succeed, then we may need an altogether different approach. For example, if helping youth get jobs just simply isn't working, I might try training them instead to become entrepreneurs and start their own businesses. Finally, if I just can't find a workable solution to the problem, I may need to make a bigger pivot and tackle a different problem altogether. In my case, perhaps it means reforming the school system or focusing on policies that could create more jobs in the country. Congratulations! You've now completed your first sprint. Continue to run experiments to test your remaining killer assumptions, then double down if they're validated. At some point, you'll have to make a bigger decision to make a recommendation to your boss, your board, or your funders that you want a bigger investment to be made, or to consider making a big pivot. When you get to that point, come back to watch the third video, where we'll discuss pulling together the results of your experiments and making a recommendation. Thank you again for joining me, and happy experimenting.